Everybody. We are just gearing up to have our webinar / conversation on gender equity and more than having just more women at the table, really creating fair organizations for everyone. So welcome. We're going to continue to admit people in from the waiting room as we go along. I'm Abby Graff. I am the Vice President of Programs and Community Engagement at the Nonprofit Alliance. Our mission is to work to support, protect, and strengthen the work of the nonprofit sector. And we do that through policy advocacy at both the federal and at the state level, as well as through education and networking. And if you don't know us, please take a look at our website. We're at www.tnpa.org, which stands for the Nonprofit Alliance. So before we start, I do feel like it feels important to all of us to acknowledge that right now in the United States, we are at a crucial cultural moment. And the Supreme Court decision has really cast a shadow over many women's hopes for equality. And many women are feeling vulnerable, feeling angry, unprotected, dismissed. Today, we really want to consider slightly different, but always related slice of how women are treated in our society and to look at the workplace equality. So when we talk about workplaces, I think we've all seen a lot of those statistics. We spend 1/3 of our lives at work. And even today, if you happen to be one of those people who's doing much of that work at home, there's still a work culture and a workplace that's taking place, even though we have an expanded definition of what that looks like physically over these past few years. So as everybody comes in, welcome. Take a minute to add in the chat and introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, if you organizationally, or even where you're calling in from geographically. If you have any burning questions that you want to make sure we get to today, you can throw those in. If they're not burning questions, but just a thought, please share that too. Additional context, we have the past few years of a pandemic and racial reckoning in the United States that have really greatly impacted the workplace. I mentioned us being off-site much more often than before. Also, historic numbers of women have left their jobs in 2021. It's resulted in the lowest women's lowest workforce participation since 1988. Women's unemployment rose to nearly 15%. And globally, women lost over $800 billion in wages. Today, now, 51% of women say that their mental health has declined and anxiety and depression rates have skyrocketed. So this is really where we're coming from as we dive into this conversation today. And as the title for this session indicates, we want to talk about more than representation, more than simply having more women at the table. We want to explore creating true organizations. I'm trying to get the word truly. We want to create organizations that are more fair on all levels. So again, introduce yourself in the chat, your organization, geographically, where you're calling in from. When you think of women in the workplace, what's the first thought that comes to mind for you? Women in the workplace, what do you imagine? What do you think about? A couple other logistic things. We did set this up as a conversation. It's a Zoom meeting and not a Zoom webinar. We did that because we want it to be a conversation. We want to all be together. We have the official speakers. We also have you, the audience, and we want to invite you to join in. That can mean through the chat. That can mean raising your hand. If we have time and space, we might invite you to come on and speak your questions. It also means you have control of your view. I have pinned the main speakers. You have a choice in your upper right hand. If you click your view, you can often look at the speaker or you can look at the gallery. The pinning should help you find us. Couple other quick acknowledgements. We did use the word women. We do acknowledge that there is a spectrum of genders these days, and we want to talk about that today. We also want to talk about race and intersectional identities. We do not believe that anybody is only a woman, just a woman, and that there are lots of pieces to everybody's identity. We will talk about that. Don't hesitate to push by putting that in the chat or asking more questions also. So right now, I keep saying in the chat, introduce yourself if you haven't. If you have a comment about what brings you here today, burning questions, see somebody else you know, say hi. I wanted to take a quick poll just to get a sense of where we're coming from in this room. So first poll, you should be able to see that now. And really thinking about your organization or your company. Where do you think you are in the process of creating an equitable workplace for women? So at the top, we treat women and men and all gender identifications equally and fairly. You can read down to the bottom would be the other end of the spectrum. There's blatant sexism here. So take a minute, kind of just off the top of your head, it is anonymous. We won't know who says what, but just to kind of get a sense of where you all are coming from, what we're looking at as far as the organizations that we're talking about. So just another 3 seconds, and then we'll take a look at those results. If you haven't yet, and if you're driving, don't do it. If you're not, pop in something. Great, let's see what we've got. And if you have something else to clarify, can you all, here, I can share the results. So if we look at these together, which I hope you can also see, it looks like we have a good section who see themselves at the top, treating women and men equally and fairly, have a specific plan, 16%, that's great. Do have a couple there at the bottom feeling that there is blatant sexism in their organization. So really across the spectrum, our biggest group is we mean well and have the best intentions, but really have a lot of room for improvement. So this feels pretty reflective to what I hear across the board. One other, if I can find it, poll that I wanted to ask is just a little more about topics, and this can help us decide where we want to go today. Here we go. And this is about the issues that you're most interested in. This, you can pick more than one, again, just off the top of your head. The issues that you're most interested in exploring right now, maybe today can help guide us. Maybe in the future, maybe it's the ones that you think that have the biggest impact. Go ahead. You're not limited to only one choice here. So if there are a couple that jump out at you, but if you're able to be a little bit discerning, that can help guide us a little bit too. And again, if you have introduction in the chat, if you've already voted for which ones and you want to tell us a little about yourself or tell us what's bringing you here today, that's great. Thanks for all the participation, everybody. A couple more seconds just to see where the energy is in the room around some of these topics. And that one that says leadership A is supposed to mean leadership composition. And if you have other ones that are not listed here, go ahead and put them in. And here we'll share what we have so far. You can put them in the chat too, if there are others that we missed in this grouping. So taking a look along what you saw, I wish there was a way that I could sort them with the highest ratings, but it looks like discrimination and microaggressions might be our most popular, leadership advancement and pay equity right up at the top, leadership composition, how many women are there, a lot of energy around these issues. So great, thank you. So excited to be here, excited to have that conversation. If you have other topics or issues, put them in the chat. If you have questions, put them in the chat or raise your hand. We want this to be interactive. We might have time at the end for a specific Q&A, but I really encourage you to, we've got a lot we could talk about over this hour. So I encourage you to pop that in as we go along. So I wanted to quickly introduce our panel. We have Amy Willard-Cross, founder of Gender Fair, which is an organization that evaluates and audits and certifies companies and now also nonprofit organizations about how well they're promoting equality, especially around gender and also considering other factors. And Andrew Gleason is advisor of gender equality and social justice at Save the Children, a nonprofit many of you know. And Helen Robert is the senior manager of digital acquisition at the Nature Conservancy. So let's jump over to our panel and start this conversation. Quick, maybe as a way of introducing yourselves, Helen and Andy, would one of you be willing just to talk, or each of you, about your organization? Where's your organization at on that scale, or come to care about gender issues?
Yeah, happy to dive right in, and really grateful to Abby and Amy and Shannon and everyone from the Nonprofit Alliance and Gender Fair for just the invitation and getting us all together. I think this is really special and timely, and excited for the conversation. I guess just a brief intro of myself and also Save the Children, and I'll get right into this. But again, Andy, I use he, him pronouns. I work on our gender equality and social justice team at Save the Children. And a lot of my work has focused on leading organizational gender equality efforts. And this intersects closely with our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives as well. And for those maybe a little unfamiliar with Save the Children, we are a child rights organization. We're over 100 years old. We work in the US and across over 100 countries across the globe on everything from health, education, child protection, and engage in programming and advocacy and development and humanitarian contexts. We kind of are a behemoth of an organization, and I think we're about 1,500 folks in our workforce in the US, and then 25,000 staff roughly globally. So there's a lot of work to be done on gender equality, advancing gender equality and broader kind of social justice issues, and excited to kind of speak to that today. I will just note kind of, we'll get more into the specifics, kind of highlighting our journey. Our team likes to say we're kind of in the work of making the invisible visible, right? And that is really important as we are tackling and addressing these root causes of inequality and discrimination. And that's both within our workplaces, but also in the contexts and communities in which we're working with across the globe. So we are kind of the disruptors. We're trying to disrupt the status quo because we know the status quo, the world we're living in right now, is inherently unequal. And so a lot of our work has been over the past 4 years since our gender equality team has surfaced within Save the Children US context and now starting to grow. We've really done a lot of that work in ensuring that we're advancing gender within our organization, looking at policies, practices, our own culture. In addition to kind of what you might think of gender equality work and kind of the programming and advocacy space. So I'll stop there because I know there's a lot to talk about today, but we certainly have been on a journey. I'm excited to share some of the advancements we've made, and especially as it's intersected with gender fair, but also the many opportunities and areas we need to improve on. So Helen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Just want to echo what you said about being so excited and grateful to have this space and opportunity to have this conversation today with everyone. So I'm Helen, I'm from the Nature Conservancy. I've been there about a year. Prior to that, I was in nonprofit direct marketing agency land. And so just coming up on my year anniversary, and I have been working on diversity, equity, inclusion committees for probably the last 10 years, and am lucky enough to serve on a great one at TNC right now. So my perspective coming into this webinar is super excited to learn and kind of chat more with Andy and Amy about the work that Gender Fair has been able to do with Save the Children. TNC has not gone through that, the Gender Fair process, and so really curious about what we can learn from what you all have done together, and also just how we can move from a state of, in the last bit of working on kind of these equity issues, moving from a state of constantly getting ready or feeling like we have to get ready for making changes to actually being really conscious about moving forward. So excited to be here and kind of share some conversation about what we have at TNC so far by way of resource groups and the committees existing, and really moving that into prioritization and influence in the work that we're doing.
And I'll introduce myself. My name is Amy Cross. I'm the founder of Gender Fair, and Gender Fair is a measurement and a standard, sort of like fair trade. We are so far the gender standard used in North America and abroad. We started for corporations, but now we're being used by nonprofits and even law firms as a way to sort of get a snapshot of where an organization is doing on gender equality. Our measurement is based on the UN's Women Empowerment Principles, and they were chosen by what's findable when it comes to publicly traded companies. Our main database is on consumer-facing publicly traded consumer companies. And now we do this, we have a special tool that will help any organization rate itself using the same process. And the main thing is that the main message I want to put across to everyone is our whole culture is trying to do better. And so we think we're doing okay, but there's, companies will say to us, well, we have a woman in marketing and we have parental leave. But as, Save the Children knows, it's more than just about representation. We have to put in lots of processes and systems in place to create fairness. So anyway, I'm excited to hear from all of you and what your organizations are doing. But that's the basics on gender fair.
Great. Thank you, guys. Welcome. And so let's just set a baseline here. And this is where I would invite people also to put in the chat. Why are you carving out an hour of your time? Why are these speakers here? Why do we care? Why do we care about this issue? What's at stake? What do we have to gain? What do we have to lose? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, I will say, we know that stakeholders in the corporate world, employees want to know how their organizations are doing when it comes to fairness and women and diversity. Shareholders want to know. Donors want to know, whether it be individual, corporate, or institutional. Like, everyone is asking these questions of all our institutions right now. How fair are you? How to everyone? And so this is not going to go away. And I think we're all of us are going to, me included, my household, we all have to work at getting fairer and asking ourselves, are we doing the best that we can? So I think it's a very important topic for any kind of organization anywhere.
Yeah, I think to build off that, Amy, we're at a really critical moment, and how are we doing this work meaningfully? A lot of what we talk about and a lot of our work at Save the Children in the gender equality and social justice space is about examining unequal power dynamics and really lifting the conversation to how are we interrogating power and how power operates in the workplace, right? And this is critical because as we look at how we operate, our manifestations of culture, that is inextricably linked to the work we're doing in communities in the US around the world. And that's an important link to make, not just about this is the right thing to do, or this is important for the bottom line, but no, this is about human dignity. This is about really challenging those unequal power dynamics that manifest themselves in, like I said before, sometimes visible and often in invisible ways. I know even in the poll, there were a lot of folks looking to examine kind of discrimination and microaggressions, not to say that there are not overt pieces of how power manifests itself in the workplace, but I think we have been moving and interrogating more these pieces around these more subtle pieces of how power shows up and how that manifests itself. So it's a really critical time to be doing this work, particularly in the nonprofit space.
Andy, I wrote down you saying interrogating power. I really like the way you phrased that. And I also think that, just to piggyback is on what you said about, especially in the nonprofit space, we tend to see a lot of women working in the nonprofit sector. And so these are compounded on top of kind of the culture that we have of being a very woman-heavy work environment. And so understanding that and who's doing the work and who's in power and how those play, how we communicate, how we hire, and what we consider service and taking things on, all are elements that add to the mix here.
Right, and that unfairness you talk about goes across many different organizations, like hospitals, the same thing, a very large female workforce, and power tends not to be female. The same thing in universities, where I think it's something like 24% of the top paid people in some of the major universities were seen to be women by the study by AUW a couple of years ago. So this is a constantly repeating pattern. And if I can start with something that I love about Save the Children, and which is why I think they're just the ne plus ultra in this work, is that we met them originally. We were at a Procter & Gamble event. Procter & Gamble is like a great supportive gender equality, supports maybe like 100 different organizations around the world. Save the Children is a great partner of theirs. And we met the Save the Children people there. And anyway, they said, well, we'd like to see how we do compared to Procter & Gamble. I was like, yeah, well, how interesting. So they did, and they put themselves with the assessment. And then they did very well. And I didn't finish telling you about the measurement, but we measure these companies, and only about 12% meet a basic metric, a basic standard of fairness of 70 on a scale of 100. So Save the Children met that bar, which only 12% of big publicly traded companies do. And then after the first year, they said, we want to do better. Like, yes, we get, we're in the top 12%, but we want to do even better. And so to me, this was like the best thing I'd ever heard. Like, not just like, oh, we got a gold star, but we want 2 gold stars. And if every organization did this, we would be fixing this problem, measuring and then improving. So I hope everyone gets inspired by that and tells their people and starts measuring or just trying to get better in their organization.
Great. Amy, maybe you started to go out a little bit there, but if we have a good connection, I'd love to hear just a little bit about what are those things that you're measuring when you do the assessment, and what are the things that are in the UN Women Empowerment Principles?
Sure. I didn't want to talk too much in the beginning because I could just talk and talk and talk. Yes. So the Women's Empowerment Principles were set up by UN Women, originally developed by Calvert, and they measure 7 different areas. We have 5 categories. We look at women's leadership. We look at employee policies, including parental leave, family-friendly policies, equal pay, non-forced arbitration around harassment. Then we also look at advertising, is the communication non-stereotyped and inclusive of diverse and people and women, and is there diversity reporting around the employee workforce, and also supplier diversity, because that's always 10% of the score. That's how you change the racial and gender wealth gap so that women and people of color can start donating to all your organizations. And then lastly, we measure philanthropy for women. And I know many of you here might have other philanthropic endeavors, but because only 1.9% of charitable giving goes to women, we think it's important that any company, for example, in our database that wants to women's dollars gives back to the community of women, because even these philanthropic efforts such as donating to Girls Who Code, that helps bring in that workforce. Now, when we look at nonprofits, what we do, instead of saying philanthropy for women, we say, speak more slowly. Yeah, sorry. Instead of when we look at nonprofits, we would say, do you have special programs for women? And this is something that the gender standards, was it called that, gender standards, Andy? Do you remember that organization, that grouping you had? So yeah, is there special programming? Right? Is there a little bit of a gender lens in programming? So that's sort of the equivalent. But that's what we measure. And again, very few companies do well by it. And I'm really excited to see more companies, smaller companies, take on our assessment, which is a quick online tool.
One other thing, Amy, talk to me a little bit. I think you had mentioned this, so remind me if I'm right or correct me if I'm wrong. You're able to assess companies whether they know you're assessing them or not.
Well, yes, there's 2 points to that. When we look at publicly traded companies, we do the journalism, and it's called data journalism, just as though U.S. News rates colleges. And we don't need their permission, we just do that. But when it comes to rating private businesses or small businesses or law firms or nonprofits, they opt in to do this online assessment. So instead of having journalists go and get the data, we have people answer these 18 questions themselves in this very secure SaaS online automated tool. So, and that information, if they do it that way, their information is only published if they want it to be published in the main database. And the main database is published. I turned off my phone, but there's an app where we publish all the data we have on publicly traded companies, and it's free. But we actually list Save the Children in this app now, because why not? It's there, and so we've made a category for them. So yes, it's opt-in for private companies, nonprofits, etc.
Got it. And then Andy, what was it like to be, clearly you all were opting into this assessment process, but what was it like to be a nonprofit organization going through it?
Yeah, I think honored to be the first nonprofit, certified and go through this process. And I did pop in the chat the minimum standards for mainstreaming gender equality is in there, and we're Save the Children's an endorser of this, so feel free to take a look. But one thing I wanted to share, a large part of my role and our work in kind of the organizational gender equality space is establishing these accountability mechanisms for gender equality, right? And Gender Fair and working with Gender Fair on the certification process is and has been one critical way for us to hold ourselves accountable to this work. And at the same time, better understand, okay, where do we have opportunities to grow? We did have opportunities to grow. It was 2020, again, that was when we were first, certified as the first nonprofit, and we did well across a number of the categories and domains that Amy had mentioned, but we learned where our gaps were and had some insights on where we could start to improve. And one area in particular from the onset after 2020 was around employee policies in particular. This included working on new kind of family-friendly employee benefits, continuing to tackle pay gaps. So I can speak a little bit later. I know that was also an issue. I have some good things to share on our own pay gap journey. But one kind of tangible piece of progression on our end from the Gender Fair piece that was spurred by Gender Fair, and also internal advocacy from our own employee resource groups. We have a parent and caregivers resource group, was in relation to our maternity and paternity leave policy. So the one thing that we did was extend our parental leave coverage from 6 weeks to 12 weeks leave at 100% paid. And in addition to that, we created an additional leave category called Caregiver Leave. And this gave staff 2 additional weeks off per year to use when caring for a family member, either immediate or extended. So we're really intentional about even being more inclusive and expansive in our own definitions of caregiving, particularly at that time and during this time of COVID, and needing to provide or have caregiving responsibilities. So these were some really tangible pieces that, were spurred on by the Gender Fair certification and re-examining some of our policies and practices, and excited, to announce in 2021. So this past year, we, kind of accepted that challenge of continuing to improve, and we're the second highest scoring organization in Gender Fair's index of 800 leading consumer companies. So again, we still have many things that we're working on, and happy to expand on that a bit later, but just wanted to share that this is one mechanism for us that's critical as an accountability mechanism to this work, and continues to surface places where we can even improve.
Gosh, I would love if nonprofits took over that top part of that, about those ratings and rankings. Helen, from your perspective, does this, well, and maybe from both, Andy, I'm sorry, I'm jumping. Did you feel like there was any resistance? Was everybody at Save the Children just on board from the get-go, or?
Yeah, I'll share briefly some context on the journey. Our gender equality and social justice team came on board to the organization, our US organization, about 4 years ago. And I'd say the kind of metaphor here is that we have been knocking on open doors, particularly with senior leadership. And there is political will and buy-in from the top on these issues. But this isn't about just changing policies or just representation, right? This is about culture change, norm change, behavior change, and this takes a long time. So something that we did from the onset of our team is establish this gender equality hub, which we have folks from across the organization, not just program staff, but people from fundraising, from communications, from IT, from HR, who came together, who are committed to advancing our gender equality and social justice strategy. Because it's not just myself as a gender advisor or a gender team that is responsible for tackling and addressing unequal power imbalances, right, in our work. This is a lens that all staff need to take and all need to take part in. So that was a critical mechanism to create this buy-in over time. And again, we still are building out our architecture, and that continues to be iterative work. But just to respond to your question, that's been part of the journey of building that lens throughout the organization.
And then clearly the organization has some commitment, your title alone being focused on this. There is an investment organizationally on this, right? So
yes, there's an investment. We launched our first ever strategy 4 years ago. We have a gender equality policy at our global level. And we are currently expanding our team, which is exciting, and the social justice component is critical. And that really speaks to our approach to this work, and something that you mentioned, Abby, in the beginning. We take, yes, an inside out approach to this work. Yes, we take an intersectional lens to this work. It's centered in kind of gender and gender theory, but recognizing that we as humans are not just experiencing our gender at any one time, right? We are experiencing our sexuality, we're experiencing race, we're experiencing our ability. And those systems of oppression impact us in very different ways in how we operate in the world. So that's an important approach. And then the social justice piece is that we're connected to much broader movements and social justice movements, the feminist movement, other movements, right? We need to recognize that and be part and contribute to that struggle and movement constructively.
great, thanks. Helen, I want to pass the mic over to you. What are your thoughts as far as looking at this from an organization and several past organizations that have not gone through this really explicit assessment process? What does it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that the assessment process exists, because I think that so often this type of work gets lumped together with oh, we're talking about it, so we're doing something about it, and it's kind of like a nice to have, like, oh, look, we have really basic 6 weeks maternity leave, right? Or, oh, we have also a ping pong table in the break room. And it's just not the same type of priority as other work gets done. And so I think that what I've seen be a conflict or a stopper in some instances is the reality check moment of, like, everybody thinks that they're doing great, or the majority of our survey today, right? We all think we're pretty well intended. Maybe we have some work to do, that sort of thing. But I think when we actually look at the numbers, or when we've conducted, in my experience, we've conducted surveys that actually have explicitly said this is the level of harm that's been experienced, there is a resistance to kind of believing those numbers and maybe taking action. There's a processing time that needs to happen. So I don't know if Andy or Amy, if you can kind of speak to what that's like and how you've been able to support this work through that piece of the process, because I think that, to my earlier comment, right, we spend a lot of time getting ready for this kind of work before we're able to move it forward. Maybe we develop the committee, maybe we start a workshop, maybe we start the conversations, but really being able to, Andy, as you said, like, knock on those open doors is a different kind of momentum. And so if you two can speak to anything that was either a surprise but you had to maybe work through with someone in leadership in order to get their buy-in and kind of push forward.
Well, I think you're right about people's resistance to measurement, and because it's a scary thing, and resistance to take real action, right? That people just like to study and talk. So that's a difficulty in all our work. Just even the chat, you can see how people are saying women feel undervalued and not listened to in the workforce. So I think that this is one. I think a lot of organizations have ERGs, and I sort of see them as unions for employees. And I've seen ERGs, single topic ERGs, advocate
and just
for.
To say employee resource group.
Employee resource group. Sorry, ERGs, and sometimes they, Coca-Cola ERG, men and women working together advocated for parental leave. So I think if there are groups like this in your organization, that's one way to talk to management about one's needs. It's not necessarily a union, but almost functions as a union, collective voices speaking together about what the people on the ground need. Because if you don't get your needs answered, people won't be staying, and everyone knows that. What about you, Andy? What do you say to that?
Yeah, something that's been transformative, and I kind of want to stick with some of the accountability mechanisms pieces, because I think they're very important. In addition to, gender fair, and in parallel, and I think I've spoken to this with this, Amy, with you, is that we have since 2018 institutionalized these internal what we call culture surveys and culture assessments. And in 2018, it was as a result of our own Me Too moment at Save the Children and addressing harassment and discrimination in the workplace. However, we just came off of our last culture survey this past year, which really examined gender equality, broader diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, among other pieces, in this kind of assessment process that took us 5 to 6 months. That was this really interdisciplinary collaboration between our gender equality team, our DEI colleagues, our diversity, equity, and inclusion colleagues, and our human resources team. And this collaboration, I don't want to overstate it, because particularly at such a large organization, and having folks see from their vantage points, like, oh no, this is part of the ethos of my work, even though I might not have justice in my title, right? This is part of me trying to take away the barriers and inequalities that exist within the organization. So as a result of that process, it was transformative in and of itself. But it's an accountability mechanism where we could hear from staff, from a survey, from additional focus group discussions with staff, and working with our employee affinity groups, lifting up and amplifying their voices. What are some of the barriers you're experiencing? And this gets back to the piece around discrimination and microaggressions. Well, we noticed there were some experiences of more overt forms of harassment and discrimination, but a lot of what we were kind of analyzing and interrogating and lifting up were those oftentimes invisible pieces of unequal power dynamics coming into play. So for example, our LGBTQI plus identifying colleagues shared that only 56% of those colleagues who answered this question felt that they could bring their true, whole, authentic self to the workplace. That's almost another, less than 50% that cannot do that. So what does that say, right? That says that we need to work to be an organization that is more inclusive and take away the barriers for LGBTQ staff and allies. What we've done as a result of this is we actually just this Pride Month rolled out inclusion trainings for people managers to improve and start to provide managers with skills and competencies about how we can create a more safe, supportive working environment for LGBTQ staff. That's one example of the type of action that's come from these recommendations. So I share that as these accountability mechanisms are really important to establish and institutionalize and bring everyone along in the process, that this is my responsibility too, as an employee of this organization, to tackle inequalities that exist, right? Because it speaks to some of that power and privilege piece that we may know or not know that we have and perpetuate in the organization.
So helpful. I just want to call out too that what it sounds like is also the adopting and making it routinized and not just resting back and saying the work is done. I think that's like, it's really easy to say that we're going to continue to work on it, right? But making sure that it keeps happening seems like it's been a pillar in kind of your success with it, it sounds like. And in terms of the conversations, in terms of making sure that there's overarching connection between the groups that are working on similar things, and finding power in that number of folks that are kind of moving things forward.
I just put a question in the chat. I wanted to know, of the people who are here today, do many of your organizations do these culture surveys? Are they considered useful, expensive? I don't know. Are they common in the field, Andy, or are you an outlier to do them?
So in kind of our, what I'll call, say, gender equality sector or thematic area, gender audits is what they've been called, have happened for a long time. I know Interaction has a great gender audit methodology that we actually use to adapt for these types of culture surveys and tools. And they can be adapted, especially with the kind of more intentionality around diversity, equity, inclusion. I want to pick up on Helen, the iterative process to this is very important, right? And I think it speaks to, it's not just a one and done, because we are shaped by the society in which we're in. So these inequalities and barriers are dynamic, they're fluid. Power is dynamic and fluid and shows up in very different ways. And we need to continue to examine that over time. Excitingly, we've not only done this in our US context, but we have our country offices across our global federation starting this process, adapting based on kind of their needs. Some are diving further into more LGBTQ inclusion, disability inclusion, and other pieces as it relates to their context. But yeah, eager to hear if others have experience in this space as well.
It looks like we're getting a little bit of mix, that not doing those cultural or doing them. I think it also could have to do with the size of an organization, a big organization where maybe a smaller one thinks that
Right, but
they
then
are already in touch with everybody. Yeah,
sorry.
Go ahead, Amy.
Then how would an organization find out? Like, so our measurement can find out if the basics are in place, if there's, you know, a modicum of women's leadership, if there's certain policies in place, but we can't necessarily find out if there, you know, if it's a culture where there are microaggressions and people don't feel really a sense of inclusion or belonging. So, I mean, I would think the two could go hand in hand. But then, how would a small organization find out? We have these great policies, but if the staff still aren't feeling valued or equal or included or a sense of belonging, I don't know how they would find that out. I don't know. That's a question to everybody else. How would you find that out in a smaller nonprofit organization if people feel valued?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. If people want to keep that in the chat, that's great. I wanted to go back to one of the specifics. We had talked about it a little bit in preparing for this, that there's a little bit of an irony that Save the Children was female founded, female led. And then if I can out a little bit, when you went through the whole survey, one of the things that turned up was still a gender pay gap. So I'm curious about that as a surprise. And at some point, I'd love to get into just like the nitty gritty. How do you even start correcting a pay gap?
Yeah. So we, thanks for calling this out, and very important. And particularly within this framing, right, of you know, more than women at the table. This is really appropriate. So we have, to give context for those on the call, we have a female president and CEO. We were founded by human rights activist, suffragist Eglantine Jebb over 100 years ago. Right now, we have, you know, over 50% of our board and senior leadership team is female. 80% roughly of our staff is female. And yet, and I think I might have made this point in the beginning, you know, representation alone does not equate to gender equality, right? Representation is critical, it's important. And at the same time, it often doesn't get to also some of those barriers, inequalities, and power dynamics that show up in the workplace, and how it operates in the workplace. So we did I think there was this a few years back, it was in the 2017 timeframe, 2018 timeframe. I think there was generally a sentiment that, you know, gosh, 80% female, we couldn't have a gender pay gap, you know? But no, we did have a gender pay gap. We did a gender pay gap analysis back in 2018. And we, at the time, came to find out that we had a 10.5% pay gap between men and women. For some context, the gender median pay gap in the US at the time was around 18 to 19%. So yes, we were below the US, but inequality is inequality, a pay gap is pay gap. So our senior leadership team was very committed to significantly closing the pay gap, and we closed the gap to 4% by January of 2020 and have since effectively closed the median pay gap, hovering around plus or minus 1% to 2%. And that has been something that we do, of course, on an annual basis of continuing that analysis, right? But also ensuring that we're not letting this happen again. So in addition to, you know, that iterative process of doing these analyses, ensuring that senior leadership continues to champion this effort is critical. We also looked at banning the use of prior salary history in the hiring process. Also looked at providing, transparent reporting to staff, which is really important for communications and transparency, and publishing our salary grading scales online as well to be transparent. And then the last thing that we've kind of action step we've taken is ensuring that, the hiring, the merit, the equity adjustments and promotion processes are free, or trying to tackle any gender bias that is happening within those. So that's an ongoing process. I'll stop there, but that's a little bit of our journey.
Yeah, that's helpful. One quick question, Amy, I was going to ask you too, and then you can add your piece also. When you measure a pay gap, what are you looking at? Somebody was just asking, how do you measure that gap? How do you find that number?
Well, there's two ways. There's the raw pay gap and there's the median pay gap. In the United States, what we mainly do is we check like job for like job. In the UK now, by law, they do the aggregate salaries of women and the aggregate salaries of men, which shows the inequality of women. But mainly here, we do this like for like job, and but still a lot of companies come up short. What I find so extraordinary about the Save the Children story is that, female founded, women leading, and still there's unfairness in pay. This just shows how, we have to work very hard in our culture to create fairness. It's not something that comes naturally to us, or we receive these old-fashioned, we have this received knowledge that's not right, and so you have to work really hard and measure it. And we have some proprietary research this group ABX did for Gender Fair. We asked people about the workforce, and what they cared about most were protections from sexual harassment and equal pay. It's the best why we work, for money. So it was, Andy, I just still find that story astonishing that an organization like yours could have a pay gap. And I'm sure if that's true of Save the Children, just think about everywhere else how it must be. So.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts going through my mind right now, but there is a piece, for a while we were told lean in, women are told lean in. Like there's some, where's the responsibility for creating the problem, and then I guess even more importantly, correcting the problem.
Right. It's not really an individual problem, is it? I think it's all that we have to change these systems, and we change them by advocacy, by measurement is one way, but I think. And everyone asking institutions to do better, and it's pretty astonishing.
I think.
Yeah, Chelsea just shared in the chat a great story, saying that her biggest raise came out of an equity audit, and so she feels happy that it happened, and also that mixed feeling of knowing that it was that big of a gap for that many years. So yes. I
mean, the best practice these days is transparent pay scales, which several companies do. And if I don't know if many of you are in Washington, where I grew up, but we knew what everyone's GS number was in Washington. It was very standard. And the federal government has had one of the lowest pay gaps, and Congress, of course, has one of the best. No pay gap. Women and men Congress people are paid the same amount. So it makes me want to run for Congress. Yeah.
Well, and then I'm curious too. We're from the nonprofit sector and the Nonprofit Alliance, and I think. There's both the internal question, what's similar and different for nonprofits, but also, as you've talked about, stakeholders, shareholders wanting this kind of accountability. I'm curious what you've seen from funders and from donors, large and small, asking for this kind of accountability. And I don't know, Helen or Andy, if you're witness to that in your organization, are people asking for it? And it's interesting because I was going to say that neither of your missions were really gender focused, but Andy, it sounds like yours is adjacent, perhaps, or you consider the gender part of the.
Yeah, to respond to that, it is are really looking at those who are most impacted by inequality and discrimination. A gender lens has to be at the center, because there's no society on this earth that is gender equal, and so that's the lens we look through, recognizing the intersecting power dynamics that exist. I don't have, since we are so large, I think some of my colleagues in resource development might have some more, particular insight into that. But what I have noticed, on the pay gap piece in particular, but what I have noticed is an increased request for internal gender equality and diversity, equity, inclusion journey, and what are you doing in this space in a meaningful way, which would include gender pay gap analyses amongst other pieces. So I think that's both encouraging. And at the same time, I think it's on us, or personally, I would say it's on us to be using our relationship with our funders and our donors to be also educating, sharing our experiences and how we're advancing this work. Because there is an inherent power dynamic with our funders and donors as well that we need to take into account. So, but yeah, I've been encouraged by at least the increased ask.
Great. And Helen, what about from your perspective?
So from my perspective, I'm not sure that I'm seeing so much of an ask in that direct way, but again, I think the internal appetite for understanding and transparency is definitely there. We do have resources that show salary ranges, and we also adjust salaries for like location with so many folks working remote and internationally. And so those are available, although I will say my personal opinion on them is that they're a little tricky to figure out where you are. But our HR team does work to look at the median salary, the midpoint of salaries, and then try not to go like past that in terms of how the ranges that we can offer for jobs and what we're paid. So there's a lot of science and thought that's gone into it. I don't know that I'm in the hiring process right now, and even in some of the conversations with candidates about salary range, I feel like that the gender dynamic is coming out a little bit in terms of how I'm communicating with those candidates about what they expect, whether they're male versus female. But it's just interesting. But yeah, we do have those resources on a larger scale, but being able to put them into practice and then again, making sure, like, I don't know what our standards are. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I don't personally know our standards on like how often we do equity, surveys or address that. And so I think that kind of information again is it's one thing to have it, and it's another thing to make sure it's populated and that people can understand it. And so making sure that those things get put into action. Yeah.
Great. And then I'm curious, from your fundraising perspective, is the gender lens playing into your decision-making around communications or around what the websites or the appeals look like or image selection?
So I would say probably on some level, if most of our staff that's creating them is female, whether or not we structure it like that or not. But I think that bias probably just naturally comes into play already. And there are lots of studies, right, that show the way that we communicate to women and the words that women pick up on are different than men. And so I don't know that that's something that we speak to specifically in our communications. And there's a lot of ways that you can market to different groups of people, right? But from that perspective, I don't know that it's something that's at the forefront of our brains when we're designing things, but we do have a large team of women writing and creating, and so I'm sure that plays into it a bit from that perspective.
I have a question, Helen. What percentage of your donors are women versus men?
So probably I think I've got to look at the numbers. Sorry, I've changed roles like 5 times, Amy. So I'm thinking about all my different programs here. I would say we're probably close to a little bit more half and half than other organizations. But also that can change depending on the type, like it ranges depending on the type of giving. So if you're giving in the mail, if you're giving online, there's different kind of demographics that go with the different ways and programs that people give to.
I see, it's not global, but just curious. All right, well, back to this idea of the pay gap measurement. That is the thing that people do care about most, and it's very easy to do. I'll send out some resources later on about, inexpensive ways to do it. But the other point is about measurement is that we've been measuring public companies for several years now, and we look at 18 data points. The 2 points that have moved in all this time are women on the board and parental leave, because those are the two metrics that are watched and reported on in the larger culture. But the number of women in the top paid leadership position hasn't moved. It's around 14%. That means like the top 5 paid people at big companies. So just for all of you in your organizations, the more you can measure things, even if it's just a pay gap, even if that's one thing you can get your organization to do, that sets you on the road to fairness. You may not be able to change all your systems of leadership and all that, but a gender pay gap audit is something that the Obama White House had companies start doing in 2016. So it's about, it's going to be more and more common, and everyone's going to start demanding it. So that's a very first easy place to start.
Great. And I know we're getting close to the top of that hour. I have one more question, but if people in the audience have questions that are you really want us to get at to, go ahead and pop those into the chat. But I do want to just look at us on the screen. We're four white people talking about gender issues. I think that the majority of the people on our call are actually white people. How does this intersect with all the conversations around race and other types of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we're hoping to create in our culture? Work culture, society at large culture, personal family cultures.
Yeah, I think I can jump in quickly here. This is where, at least from our perspective, our intersectional approach to this work is critical. And I know that word is used a lot, thrown around a lot, but our work is grounded in gender equality, but using an intersectional lens and approach to recognize that there are intersecting forms of oppression that impact people. And like I said before, impact how they experience marginalization, how they experience advantage, disadvantage in the workplace, outside of the workplace. And that's critical to addressing inequalities. I'd encourage us not to, I'd encourage us to move from kind of a categorization of people and groups to really talking about how does power and pieces like racism and sexism and homophobia impact people, because it impacts people in very different ways. And that's why when we did the culture survey, we looked beyond gender at DEI, anti-racism issues, disability, et cetera. So it's very complex, but absolutely we need to be doing this work, particularly as a white person in this space.
Right. Well, this sector is, of course, not very diverse sector, right? It's a very white sector. So that's even probably less diverse than the corporate sector. But I think we all have to realize that we have to solve for the least advantage in our culture, and then we solve for more people, and we have to make these discussions much more inclusive in every single way.
Helen, I'm pausing to give you a chance to jump in here, but
yeah, I also just phoned a friend on the side to make sure that I knew my number of percentage, and it is overall, we are what I thought over about 50% female, just over, but again, it's just such a skew. And so as we look at this and the other ways that intersectionality comes into play, I just think there's so many tools out there. My takeaway from like these conversations is just kind of the empowerment to continue to have conversation across the board with other organizations, with other colleagues, and see what we can do to kind of push those initiatives forward. There's a lot that at TNC we're working on, and we have all these groups and these resources available to us, but I don't know that I don't know where we all are in holding the rope that's leading us forward. So I think that that's kind of where my mind is right now, in thinking through how we navigate the role that this plays in larger DEI and intersectionality work.
Great, thank you. And that's a great segue to kind of work towards wrapping us up. I do feel like we've scratched the surface on so many. We could have 5 more hours, if not whole careers committed to this. But Amy or Andy, do you have, what would you say for kind of the wrap up, send off? I appreciate Helen's, I was on pace with you on, we need to keep talking. So that, Andy and Amy.
Talking, advocating, and acting, because there's frankly just way too much talk and way too much research, and you can just institute, well, even we're talking about pay, you can institute processes that are fair. I've heard people in the chat, there was stuff about succession planning. There's ways, there's even calculators for companies to make sure they do salary raises at the right level instead of just by feeling. So all of these things, not all of this, these things can be fixed by process in many ways. So action is the key.
Yeah, briefly, I think I'll go back to the work of making the invisible visible. We live in and operate in spaces that center very few narratives, you know, the male experience, the hetero experience, able-bodied experience, etc. How are we continuing to challenge that, deconstruct that? How are we continuing to look at our own biases and privileges in any situation? So I'll leave it at that. But thank you so much, Abby and Amy and Helen.
Yes, thank you, all three of you, for giving us an hour. Thank you, everybody who joined us to start this thinking. And yes, we need part 2s and 3s to keep it going in our planning and acting. So thank you, everybody. Great to have you here. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Well, hail to the TNPA for organizing this. Thank you so much, Abby and Shannon.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you all for doing the work you're doing.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.